Mia remained motionless in the kitchen, clutching the counter as the moon shone through the window. Daniel spoke in a low, almost whispery tone behind her. "Mia, you've always been important to me."
More than I ought to.
When his hand touched hers, the warmth sent goosebumps down her spine, causing her to catch her breath. As the gap between them closed, she turned to face him, her heart racing. Mia never imagined that her relationship with her stepfather, Daniel, would be anything but positive. Although he was always supportive and courteous, their relationship had been superficial since he married her mother when she was 16. He was their family's steadfast, dependable member who kept to himself but was always available when they needed him. However, things started to change over time. Daniel and Mia frequently found themselves alone in the house due to her mother's long working hours. It began casually, with light conversation over dinner and shared laughter while watching a television program. However, there have been times recently when things lasted longer than they should have. Mia returned home from her night class late one evening, wired but exhausted. She discovered Daniel in the kitchen, holding a tumbler of whiskey and wearing a thoughtful expression. "Hard day?" she asked, setting her purse aside. He nodded and gave a small smile. "That is what you could say. There's been a lot of work recently." Mia leaned against the counter and poured herself a glass of water. "Mom is still working after hours." "Yes," Daniel said quietly. "She hardly ever comes home these days." She paused when she detected a hint of melancholy, possibly loneliness, in his voice. Her brow furrowed as she asked, "Are you okay?" After a brief pause, he nodded. "I'm okay. I suppose I'm just exhausted." The air between them felt electrified for a moment as their gazes locked, as if something unsaid was at stake. The simmering tension eventually erupted over a week later. Mia heard Daniel enter the living room late at night, while she was up working on an assignment. She entered out of curiosity and found him reading a book on the couch. "Are you unable to sleep?" she asked, taking the seat across from him. He set aside the book and replied, "Something like that." A casual discussion ensued, but as the minutes passed, the tone shifted. Daniel's expression was unreadable as he looked into her eyes. "Mia, you've matured so much," he said quickly and softly. She dismissed the compliment with a quiet laugh. "Well, over time, that's what occurs." He insisted in a serious tone. "No, I mean it. You've grown into an amazing woman. You have my admiration." The sincerity of his speech surprised her, causing her cheeks to flush. "Daniel, thank you. That is extremely significant." A lull ensued, the silence heavy with unspoken words. He said, almost reluctantly,
You've always been important to me."
"I probably overdid it." Mia caught her breath as his words sank in. Her voice shook as she began, "Daniel, what are you saying?" As if looking for the right words, he stood and paced the room. "I'm saying I can't stop thinking about you anymore. I can no longer ignore it, despite knowing it's wrong." Her heart rate increased as she tried to process what he was saying. "It's not, we can't." With a harsh tone, he interrupted, "I know. But tell me you haven't experienced it as well." Even though she did not respond, he could tell by the way her eyes dropped to the ground. Daniel took a step forward and touched her hand. His voice was almost audible above a whisper when he said, "Tell me to stop." But she didn't. Rather, she muttered, "I can't," looking up at him, lips apart. The distance between them vanished as Daniel grabbed her face and planted a tentative but intense kiss on her lips. Mia's hands tightened around his shirt, drawing him in as the depth of their connection became apparent to her. He moved his hands to her waist and whispered, "You're amazing," into her lips. Her voice trembled with dread and desire as she responded, "And your trouble." The night progressed in a flurry of desire, and the boundaries between them dissolved as they gave in to what they had both been resisting for so long. The weight of their illegal relationship was palpable in every touch and word they exchanged, and neither could bring themselves to stop. Daniel guided her to the couch, exploring her body's curves with soft but confident hands. She felt her own hands stretch for him, bringing him closer as the warmth of his touch sent shivers down her back. The flickering light from the television cast soft shadows across the room, enclosing them in their own realm. The gentle sound of birds outside the window startled Mia. She blinked, realizing with a sinking heart that she had fallen asleep on the couch. She felt a rush of remorse and anxiety as the previous night's events came flooding back. Daniel sat in the chair opposite her, already awake, his expression unreadable. "Good morning," he replied hesitantly. "Good morning," she said, sitting up and pulling the blanket closer to herself. We must speak." "I understand," he said, his eyes unwavering yet animated. "Last night, Mia, it wasn't simply an error. For me, it was significant." His words caused her chest to tighten. "However, how about Mom? How about we? This cannot happen again." Daniel gave a slow nod as his face hurt. "I understand. I do not regret it, however. Not for one moment." Mia's stomach dropped when she heard a car enter the driveway before either of them could continue. With a worried expression on her face, she muttered, "She's home early." Daniel got to his feet and combed his hair. "I'll take care of it," he said firmly. Mia and Daniel exchanged a quick glance as her mother entered the room, beaming at them, silently admitting the secret they now shared. However, the memories of that night lingered as the days passed. And, despite their promises to continue, the weight of their relationship remained unspoken but palpable. The memories of that night hung over Mia's head like a persistent shadow as the days turned into weeks. Her thoughts were clouded with longing and guilt, and her pulse quickened whenever Daniel entered the room. When her mother was present, he avoided looking at her, but when they were alone, the tension between them became oppressive. Mia tried to divert her attention away from the increasing pressure of their secret by focusing on her schoolwork and friends. Despite her best efforts, her thoughts kept returning to him. The way he caressed her, looked at her, and gave her a sense of aliveness she'd never felt before. Mia returned home early from class one day, and the house was strangely quiet. She dropped her purse and began to walk toward the kitchen, but she came to a halt when she noticed Daniel standing by the sink, hands on the counter. Her voice startled him as she said, "Hey?" As he turned, his expression was one of surprise and trepidation. "You've arrived home early." She moved closer and said, "Class ended early. Are you all right?" He ran his hand through his hair and let out a deep sigh.
"I'm not sure," he replied.
"I've been attempting to understand everything." Mia approached and hesitated, her heart racing. "I can't stop thinking about that night, Daniel." When he looked into her eyes, something menacing flashed through them. "Don't, Mia," he pleaded, his voice tight and low. "This is not possible." "But we already did," she said tremulously. "You can't claim that you don't consider it either." He tensed his jaw and averted his gaze. He replied, "Of course, I think about it. But that doesn't mean it's correct." Mia stretched out and touched his arm, and the tension in the room was palpable. Her voice was barely audible as she asked, "What if we stopped fighting it?" Daniel's breath caught, and he froze at her touch. "You're not understanding what you're saying, Mia." She pushed closer until they were only a few inches apart, saying, "I do. I understand that this is incorrect and difficult. But I'm also aware of my feelings. I am aware that you are also experiencing it." As her words sank in, his resolve weakened. "Mia," he said in a crackling whisper, "this could make everything go wrong." With a steady gaze, she asked, "So, why are you still standing here? Why don't you just leave?" He didn't say anything, but the way his hand cupped her face revealed everything she needed to know. He gave her a desperate kiss, full of all the emotions they had been attempting to suppress. There was no holding back or hesitancy this time. The world beyond their secret crumbled into nothingness as they completely surrendered. As Mia awoke and recalled the night's events, sunlight filtered through the curtains before she dashed back. When she turned around, Daniel was already awake, sitting on the side of the bed with his head in his hands. Her voice broke the silence with a whisper, "What happens now?" He turned to face her, his gaze full of affection and agony.
"We have to solve this," he said.
"Because this will destroy us, and your mom, if it continues." Mia pulled the blanket around herself and sat up. She said in a trembling voice, "I don't know how to stop." "I'd rather not stop." Daniel's eyes were full of emotion as he looked at her. "Neither do I," he mumbled. "But, Mia, we must. For her." The sound of the front door opening interrupted their conversation. Mia's heart raced as she heard her mother's happy, uninformed voice cry out, "I have returned home. Is anybody present?" Daniel rose quickly and began to retrieve his clothes, his face turning white. His voice was frantic as he said, "You must act normally." As if nothing had occurred, Mia nodded as she quickly dressed, her chest tightening. Her mother, unaware of the tension between them, gave them a friendly smile as they entered the kitchen. However, as time passed, it became increasingly difficult to fake. It was only a matter of time before their secret was exposed. The snatched glances, the lingering touches when no one was looking. Mia was sitting in the living room one evening, scrolling through her phone, when her mother entered, looking worried. With a serious tone, she asked, "Can we talk?" Mia felt sick to her stomach. "Yes," she said, setting her phone down. Her mother sat next to her, gazing at Mia's face. "Are things going well between you and Dan? I've noticed that things seem to be different." Mia shook her head and attempted to laugh. "What do you mean?" Her mother paused, furrowing her brow. "I am not sure. You appear distracted, and he has been distant recently. You can notify me if something happens." Mia's chest constricted as she tried to remain calm. "Mom, nothing's happening. Everything is fine." Her mother nodded slowly, but her worry persisted. "If you say so. But you are aware that you can tell me anything, right?" "Of course," Mia replied, forcing a smile as her stomach knotted with regret. Mia breathed shakily as her mother left, the weight of their secret pressing down on her. One thing was certain. The further they went, the harder it would be to find their way back. She was unsure how long she could keep doing this. As the days passed, the tension in the house became unbearable. Her mother's presence served as a constant reminder of the boundary they had crossed, and Mia's heart raced whenever Daniel approached. Despite their best efforts to remain apart, there was an irresistible attraction between them. Mia was sitting in her room one evening, gazing at the ceiling, when she heard a gentle knock on the door. Her heart accelerated. Despite the turmoil inside her, she said, "Come in a firm tone." Daniel took his place and quietly closed the door. His expression was a mix of longing and shame. "Mia," he said quietly, "we must speak." Her gaze remained fixed on him as she sat up. "How about?" He ran his hand through his hair and paused. "This is what our relationship is all about. Things have gotten out of hand. The constant thoughts about you are tearing me apart." Mia crossed the room and stood in front of him, her heart racing. With a quivering voice, she asked, "Do you think it's any easier for me? Whenever I see you, Her emotions took over, and she stopped. Daniel's hand reached up to remove a lock of hair from her face, his expression darkening. He said with a strained voice, "Mia, we can't keep doing this. However, I can't avoid you either." Their emotions boiled over before either of them could speak again. Daniel clutched her face, his lips slamming into hers in a desperate kiss that contained all of the suppressed emotions they had tried to conceal. Mia responded without hesitation, grabbing his shirt and drawing him in. Her breath caught as his hands moved to her waist, and she said, "Daniel," between kisses. "This is insane." His voice was filled with desire as he said, "I know," against her lips. "But now I don't give a damn." Their movements, fueled by a combination of resistance and passion, caused the outside world to vanish as they completely surrendered. As their bond grew stronger and their boundaries dissolved, Daniel carried her to bed with ease. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway snapped them back to reality just as their desire was reaching its peak. When Mia realized her mother was home, she froze, her heart stopping. In a panicked whisper, she said, "She's back early." Daniel quickly gathered his clothes, his eyes widening as he did so. He said in an agitated tone, "We must act normally." Mia nodded, adjusting her outfit and attempting to slow her racing heart. Her hands shook. Several moments later, her mother's voice could be heard from below. "I have returned home. Are two of you present?" Daniel stepped forward and briefly touched her hand. "This isn't over," he whispered to her, maintaining eye contact. As he slipped out of the room, she nodded, speechless. Mia and Daniel exchanged brief glances as her mother entered, their secret simmering beneath the surface. However, the consequences of their actions were undeniable, and they both knew that everything would eventually fall apart. They'd started a storm that was far from over,